that self-image is, I think, the opposite of self-knowledge. In some ways, our pride is what paints the self-image, and we hope that it flatters us. Humility gives us the experience of what we're really like, and that actually produces true self-knowledge. Self-image and self-knowledge are actually always going to be opposed.
Welcome to another episode of The Golden Hour. This is Rashad Badr here with Dr. Kevin Majers. Kevin, good to see you again.
Hey, Rashad, great to be back.
Wonderful. Hey, so Kevin, we took a break for the summer, and when we stopped, I think our last podcast was on the topic of a summer to remember. So I wanted to get us back into the swing of things by asking you, what was your most memorable experience this summer?
Probably it was the many times that we went to Blue Bottle in Harvard Square when you and Sharif were in town. So, and the long conversations we had there, which all seemed to blend into one and made me think that I'd spent 10 hours there.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's wonderful.
It was great. It was, I have to say, when we have these work weeks for optimal work, it's so much fun. So
yeah, that's great.
It's one of the highlights. How about you?
That's awesome. Yeah, well, that was certainly one of them. And I'm not saying that just because I hope that they will sponsor our podcast after this, but I would say that another great experience for me, a memorable experience, was when my wife and I were able to take our sort of entire, both sides of the family to the beach, and we got to spend a week together. And that was really special. And so I would say that was probably one of the greatest highlights of the summer.
That's awesome.
Well, I'm sure we could talk about our summers for much longer, but we actually have a very interesting question that we received, one that you and I are excited to dive into. And so I can read it for our purposes, and that'll help us get started. So with that, let's shift gears and jump right back into it. Hi, Kevin. There's a series of pleasantries at the beginning, but then this person jumps in. I have been encountering quite a few people who are dealing with narcissism. Probably not so much they themselves, though at times it is hard to tell, but certainly people very close to them. Do you have any book or article recommendations for the relative to better understand how to deal with narcissists? And perhaps more difficult, do you have any suggestions to help narcissists understand, or at least notice, they're ill? Thank you very much. And this person signs off. So I think, Kevin, if it's okay with you, let's just start off by even defining narcissism. I feel like this is something that it's a label that we've heard sort of like in pop culture. What is narcissism? And then what are the different schools of thought around how to define narcissism?
So it's a myth, right? A Greek myth that is told by Ovid of a young man who ends up falling in love with his image in a reflection in a cool pool, a pool that was so far back in the woods that no sun reached it, no leaves ever fell on it. It was this totally isolated pool, and there he saw himself. He had been warned to never know himself, because if he did, that would be his end. So it's a complex story, but there seems to be in the story the kind of tragedy of self-love, is that there's some kind of self-love that goes awry, and that led to him loving something unreal, basically his image. And so really Freud is the one who came up with narcissism as we currently define it. So, and so he wrote an essay on narcissism, and that became in some ways, like one of the real beginnings, I think, of the full psychoanalytic tradition was dealing with this topic of narcissism. And certainly in Freud's own life, that's what he struggled, he talks about his struggles with it, and how he was trying to work through that himself. So I think there's a lot now of cultural baggage that has come on with narcissism and social psychology and all these things of people reporting that narcissism is now on the rise, and that the generation of, the up and coming iGen is the most narcissistic ever, and the social media is all about narcissism. But basically, in this sense, it means excessive regard for your own self-image.
When it comes to this sort of excessive regard for one's own self-image, what are some of the behavioral manifestations? And maybe we can talk about Freud. So you said maybe Freud struggled with this. Um, Having these sort of this excessive self-regard is certainly problematic, I would imagine, from a thought pattern perspective. But what would be some of the behavioral
Mhm.
manifestations of it?
Well, yeah, I'm going to deliberately avoid going the DSM route, of
Okay,
5 of 9, characteristics, and
sure.
just to say, like, what is the whole kind of sense you get of what narcissism is that the person acts selfishly and has no sense of the impact that makes on those around him or her. So there's a lack of empathy, but there's also an excessive kind of focus on doing everything for your own satisfaction.
Mm,
So you could find these kind of dynamics of the centrality of satisfaction in the life of the narcissist. And so everything is about satisfying, themselves. The lack of other centeredness in the narcissist, so that the person is in fact not ever consciously prioritizing others and the bond they have with others. So, what I think is in some ways most telling about narcissism is that when you read the stories of people who overcame narcissism and you see the changes that occur, what they report is that they are now able to bring out the best in other people around them. And then other people bring out the best in them. And again, that one dynamic seems to be in people who report getting over it. And there are books that talk about this. There's a book by called "Breaking the Mirror: Overcoming Narcissism" by Norman Goldwasser, which is a very hopeful book about how people get over it. And really, I mean, a lot of it is the kind of usual theory of narcissism. But at the end, the last chapter are stories that his patients wrote about what it was like getting over it. But the common theme there, and in fact, you see it throughout that book in all the case examples, when people are overcoming narcissism, it's the bonds with others that are finally able to develop. They then are able to bring out the best in others, and others bring out the best in them. And so there's a kind of pain that people have if they live with, being narcissistic themselves. And that pain is that everyone brings out the worst in them and they bring out the worst in everyone else. And that's just what happens when there's this kind of, self-centeredness in our lives. So that is a very painful place to be, and
mhm.
so I think that we should have empathy for narcissism, but I would be very careful about trying to this is a whole separate question, but trying to
Yeah.
actually be empathic with narcissists, because then you're having to label the person a narcissist. And I think that's almost never helpful.
Yeah. It seems that that's one of the dangers we run into, right? I think with almost everything that we talk about at Optimal Work, whether it's learning how to approach anxiety or distraction or burnout or whatever it is, I think one of the easiest things is for us to start turning our sights towards others and then very quickly wanting to point out how others can grow rather than looking inward and saying, really, where is this most applicable to me?
Yeah.
And I remember in one of our earlier conversations that you had said that really some of the biggest obstacles to growth are things like blaming others, provisional thinking, things like that, and that these are really obstacles within ourselves um, that that can be quite subtle.
That's exactly right. I think that blaming others is a great example of a behavior that happens when others are bringing out the worst in you and you're bringing out the worst in them. Then, and it's a cycle that has to get broken somehow. And the only way it can be broken is by taking ownership of your own behavior. And you can't take ownership of other people's behavior, but you can take ownership of your own and say, there's something that Wasserman says, which I like, which is the good news about being part of the problem is that you can then be part of the solution. So when you can admit in a relationship, I am part of the problem here, then there are things I can do differently, and it's actually liberating. The thing that can be hardest, I think, for narcissists to do is to take responsibility for their own actions. So they will be looking to, and this is what narcissism does to us. It just makes us notice everything bad in the others, and then blame them for that. But there is something deeply liberating and joyful to admit when we're wrong. And that's, I think, one of the joys that is the antidote to narcissism. I think there are a number of joys that the narcissist can't experience and still remain a narcissist. So the more people can learn these joys and practice the behaviors that produce those joys, the more free they actually get from narcissism.
Well, let's dive into that. But before we do, as you're talking, to me, it seems like there's an adjacency of sorts between, say, someone who's exhibiting narcissistic behaviors, wanting to blame others or others bring out the worst in them, and what we traditionally call a sort of negative processing bias. Now, how similar are these things? Are they really the same thing and we're just talking about them in different contexts? Are they different things? Help us understand whether these things fit together.
Yeah, I think that narcissism, in some sense, is the negative processing bias applied to bonds. So to people with whom you have bonds, the people around you. And so you end up disparaging the other and blaming them for what you experience, rather than doing that first thing of taking stock of yourself, diving in and admitting where you need to improve, taking ownership of things. So I think, though, it is a kind of attentional bias that happens that's just learned from a very young age. You could say, though, that there's also, more than simply the negative processing bias. There is there's another thing that goes on top of that, which is uh, the image of yourself becomes more important than yourself.
Mm.
And so protecting and projecting a certain self-image becomes important and somehow vital. And as long as we are serving our own self-image, then we, in fact, will not ever take responsibility for our actions, nor will we really be able to form bonds with others. Because the image doesn't form bonds, only the self does. And when the center of your whole life is your self-image, you're less and less capable of having meaning, of having bonds, of actually living for ideals. And so what happens is, in this dynamic then of narcissism, people are really trapped in a world without bonds, without ideals, without real opportunities for growth. And in the end, they feel very much meaninglessness and despair, isolation. That's the kind of the end game of narcissism. Because nothing really pays off in the end.
Right. It also seems to me that in those circumstances, that most things would likely become a threat, right? Because there's probably a very delicately crafted self-image or delicately held self-image, and that it's hard to imagine sort of what sort of temporal things will really build it up. It would seem to me that most things would present threats then to this image,
Yeah.
and that would be a really sad place to live.
In fact, the only thing you can do is fail, because
Right.
you're going to somehow not live up to it always. And then you're going to have to either be in denial about the times you don't live up to it, or the image becomes so powerful in your mind that you're no longer really in touch with who you really are. So I think that the self-image can become a project for people. It's like it's the thing that they're always working on. It's why they want to go to med school, or it's why they want to get into this particular college, or it's why they want this kind of job, so that their image is somehow stabilized and protected. So you have this kind of self-image project that we can embark on. Uh, well, that self-image is, I think, the opposite of self-knowledge. In some ways, our pride is what paints the self-image, and we hope that it flatters us. Humility gives us the experience of what we're really like, and that actually produces true self-knowledge. And the image, self-image and self-knowledge are actually kind of always going to be opposed. So if you think of yourself as a guy who is very cool, unflappable, and cheerful, a great guy to be around, and that's your self-image, and it's very somehow um, like engraved in who you are and your self-concept. Well, you're probably not going to then notice all the times when you're not cool, when you're not cheerful, when you're not fun to be around. So you'll tend to see only evidence that confirms this image, and they'll tend, to ignore everything that goes against it. So you end up then missing the opportunities to grow, because how would you even think of growing then? So there's something that happens, I think, when, for instance, when we fail at something, that failure can be the shining of a light on a kind of limit to our current abilities. And that can be, in some ways, encouraging. Like, okay, now I know what to be focusing on. I know what to get better at. So it's just like if you get feedback and you get some kind of negative feedback. Well, I think that if we're just all about protecting our own self-image, I think then it's going to be that we're just going to tend to reject negative feedback. We certainly don't use it to grow, or we just, I don't know, blame the person who gave it as being somehow um, the problem rather than us. I think there can be a sense, where we see that no, these things that get unveiled, yeah, they might make us feel shame briefly, but that's where then we can actually have traction. That's where we can grow and we can strategize that real growth. So that's what true self-knowledge unveils for us, the real ways of growing, versus just building up our own self-image.
Oftentimes we avoid using labels. In fact, we oftentimes talk about placing people on respective learning curves. Mm-hmm. Here we've used the language of narcissists and not. Mm-hmm. How do we think about that? Is that a helpful label for us, or is there a little narcissist in all of us? I guess is what I'm asking, because of this idea of the learning curve. Help us to piece that together.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And it shows the difficulty of talking sometimes about these concepts, that as you talk about them, you can get somehow caught in a dialectic of what is narcissistic, what's not narcissistic, who is narcissistic, who's not. And you can go through life then spotting the narcissist, which I think is a very cynical and negative game to play, because in fact, all of us have narcissism. Narcissism is what I think is just it's the tendency to put satisfying ourselves and building our self-image over real growth and ideals and bonds. And that's a tension everyone has. And so if we have trouble seeing the moments when we are doing that, then we are in fact suffering from some narcissism ourselves. So being sincere with yourself is like, that's the antidote, I think. And having joy in being sincere, having joy in like apologizing and in admitting when we're wrong and in putting things right. That kind of joy, I think, is deeply healing to us. And if you're enjoying the process of admitting a mistake, admitting that you're wrong, trying to, find a way to grow, and you find joy in that, that can be like the best assurance then that you are escaping narcissism. So if you can have joy in forming real bonds with others and finding ways to bring out the best in others, you would be overcoming narcissism by doing that, and letting others bring out your best. So I think that there can be ways that you can use these concepts to talk about them. The wrong use of it would be to label other people in your life, and to especially people that you're in close relationships with. Because anytime someone really goes against what you want, it's very easy to see that person as a narcissist. And so I don't know, I think it's something you would never want to label someone else with. But if you can detect your own and then find the right path to overcome it, I think that's actually very fruitful, because it really is just another word then for overcoming pride, and outsmarting it in some way.
It would be interesting to see. I can imagine. I'm trying to, as we're talking here, I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of someone perhaps who's listening, saying, "Okay, wow, either this really resonated with me, or despite our many caveats, this fits someone else's bill." And then from there, uh, wanting to try and understand what the journey out of this is, because I think at some point, and I'd love to hear your response here, they got there because they thought they were selecting the good in some way. Right? At some point in time, they thought what they were doing was in fact the good, right? Either it was the pursuit of satisfaction, which they thought was the good, or they thought that they were doing something noble in some way, but maybe they got lost along the way. How do people start to find a path out of this? Okay, I'm exhibiting a lot of the sort of characteristics that you said. I'm placing my satisfaction over bonds. Others bring out the worst in me. To go from that to, I'm going to have greater sincerity, and I'm going to be joyful in the process of having greater sincerity, seems like quite the leap. What would you offer to someone who's expressing that sentiment?
Well, maybe the first thing is trying to get our minds around what would be the most difficult thing about doing that. So, say for instance, just to give a benign example, is there any? I'm not seriously asking you, but I'll ask you: is there any brand of clothing that you would never be caught dead wearing? Because you
I'm sure there
associate it
are,
somehow.
Kevin.
I'm sure there are. Exactly. Same here. And it's just like, from your high school experience, you're like, oh, I'm not going to wear that brand. Or I'm not going to wear that thing. Or, okay,
Sure.
what would it be like to actually wear that brand? And to go out and buy an outfit that doesn't exactly match with clothes that aren't that great, and to present that and then to go somewhere wearing that. What one would experience in that case would be, I think, you would see actually the falseness of your self-image being threatened by this kind of
Mm.
thing. That in fact, you are still who you are. And your ability to do this voluntarily is an even greater and stronger thing than living in fear of this. So you'd be able to see that the reaction we have of shame can be totally embraced. You can feel it fully, and it doesn't have to govern you at all. So there is a good kind of shamelessness that is really a kind of freedom that we can learn to have, that we are, um, when we can find those little things, it'd be like if you're about to give a talk in front of a large audience and you ended up spilling some coffee on yourself. To not change, but just let the stain be there, and you're just going to drink it in. So
Mm.
if you could enjoy those little moments and just say, okay, this is actually going to be liberating for me. I think shame avoidance is one of the central dynamics of narcissism. It's like a phobia of feeling shame. And shame is in some ways always the result of not our self being wrong. I think that's guilt, but it's the image looking bad. That's shame. And
Mm.
so that's why we can be shameless. And that's actually can be a virtuous state to be in. It can be actually something very good for us, to not be protecting our self-image, and that's a totally different thing than our actual self being bad by doing something evil, which is then feeling guilty about it. In the ideal world, I think we clarify the difference between guilt and shame. We despise the phobia of shame. Okay, that no, and so we don't let these not having things embarrass us. No, that doesn't mean that you can't dress well. It doesn't mean you can't, do things that maintain a certain kind of standard, but you shouldn't do it out of a phobia. Ideally, it's just a way of serving those around you. And so, you for the people that you work with and your family in your life, you want to make yourself as attractive as you can, but without excessive effort, without any worrying about not being. But still, there's a certain carefulness there that is really thoughtfulness of others. So everything can be lived, in fact, and then relationally as a way of loving others. And gradually, that's where the narcissist, the person struggling with this, has to learn to shift, is doing things for the sake of others, not simply out of any kind of self-satisfaction or fear, but to actually do good and to surprise those with goodness around them.
Mm. And so perhaps another example could be if someone's in a workplace and they feel perhaps an anxiety or fear or dread about not knowing something that they should know,
Mhm.
right? It could be simply welcoming the sensation and saying, I don't know, I can find out for you, or maybe my colleague knows, or in some way trying to build someone else up in that
Yeah.
moment of that dread or that anxiety. Is that a fair
Yeah.
characterization?
I think that's right. Being able to admit you don't know something, is an act of strength, not weakness. And you actually become stronger by doing it. And that's how you learn things too. So it's a wonderful compliment to tell someone, "Hey, I don't know anything about that. Tell me more." And then you're just interested and you let them, this is actually how you bring out the best in others. They are able to showcase more what they know, and then you're able to learn from them. So being able to admit ignorance, being able to admit some failure, being able to admit a mistake that we made, being able to, all of that I think is crucial. And seeing that in fact the self is made stronger by these very things that the self-image would fear. Like to protect our self-image, we would avoid those things. But the less you try to protect your self-image, the more you can actually work on growing your stronger yourself and who you really deeply are.
Yeah. And there seems to be a sort of a very beautiful self-forgetfulness in that, right? Where you can just give of yourself with pure intention rather than trying to guard yourself or to guard an image and to have your behaviors hemmed in by those concerns.
Mm, exactly. So I think that the three qualities, the three ideals that are most powerful for overcoming narcissism are sincerity, humility, generosity. Interesting. If you look at the 12 steps program for Alcoholics Anonymous and then all the other ones, those 12 steps are essentially those three things, just drawn out
Mm.
into more and more steps. So there's a big focus on taking stock of your life, admitting what you did wrong, admitting how you hurt other people. There's this kind of ruthless sincerity that they encourage in taking stock. But there's also the sense then of humility, of then being able to focus instead on God and others in your life, to be shifting the focus away from them, not needing to protect your self image, but instead, letting your attention be more and more filled with other people and with God as you understand
Mm.
Him. So the 12 steps say. And then the generosity is in actually making amends and living in a way worthy of your highest ideals. So sincerity is, what are you really seeking? And then humility is that forgetting of self entirely to serve the others. Generosity is just the completion of that. But now you can really give your best to the others. So what 12 Steps has been known for is being one of the best anti-narcissism programs ever devised. And the psychiatrists that I know who are Freudian, they respect 12 Steps in how it can handle narcissism so well. And
Mm.
that's my experience too. The people who really benefit from it, it's because that they could actually take this inventory of themselves. They could learn to focus on others, and they could learn to give themselves to others, particularly by admitting what they did wrong.
Well, that's very powerful. This introduces a whole other set of questions that perhaps we can save for another podcast around the topic of self-love. Because I feel
Yeah,
like as we were throughout this entire conversation, there's this topic sort of in the background. And I
yeah,
think perhaps more authentic understandings of it, perhaps misguided understandings of it. How do we make sense of it? And maybe that's another good podcast for us.
that would be great. Let's do it. We'll be back then.
Awesome. We'll be back. Thanks so much, Kevin.
Thank you, Sean.
Well, thanks so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Don't forget to check out optimwork.com for a set of online tools to help you engage challenge in your life. See you next week.